welcome. Welcome to our presentation today. Mostly Dead is Still Slightly Alive, Premature Burial, Dracula, and the Rise of the Cremation Movement. Today's presentation is hosted by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. And this event is part of Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences in the College of Liberal Arts, and I will be your host for today's presentation. So thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we continue our journey into different aspects of this spooky season. Throughout today's conversation, I encourage you to submit a question or reaction or comment for our presenter to address in the second portion of the event. And to do this, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter in your question. This event is being recorded and will be shared out with all registered participants and will be available on the event page early next week. Today's presenter is Dr. Tandy Treiber. Dr. Tandy Treiber is a senior lecturer in English at the University of Minnesota. She teaches death studies courses and British literature from Beowulf to the present. She has given many presentations, both academic and general interest, on garden cemeteries, anatomical models, anatomy theaters, Egyptology, and archaeology, both urban and imperial. Dr. Tandy Treiber, thank you for joining us, and I invite you to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for being here. I am so pleased to be part of this series of presentations, and I'm particularly excited about it because I'm involved in two initiatives on campus: the Health Humanities Project, which is working to bring people in the medical school and the CLA together for mutual pedagogical and scholarly benefit, but also a death studies initiative of this vision of bringing death studies to the University of Minnesota. It's a growing and important field that intersects with all disciplines, and currently the U.S. lacks a comprehensive interdisciplinary death studies research center, and there are many of us who think the U of M would be perfect for that. So I'm going to get my screen going. Okay. So before I start, I'm never quite sure what kind of disclaimer is needed, but I also feel that a disclaimer is never a bad idea. So I just wanted to let you know that I will be discussing and quoting rather detailed descriptions of what people imagined the experience of being prematurely buried was like, as well as some techniques practiced upon corpses that are a bit graphic. But I will not be showing you any images of actual bodies. I just want to make sure I get that out there. Everybody got your lunch? You good? Okay. So I came at this project in a rather backwards way. I was working on Bram Stoker's novel Dracula and science and technology in that novel and trying to get some ideas to settle into place about, well, I mean, you all know what there's a lot of in Dracula, right? Besides blood. That's right. Dirt. There's a ton of dirt in this novel. Dirt, dust, earth, ashes. The novel's full of dirt, often in combination with blood and bodies. Dracula describes his homeland as having hardly a foot of soil in all the region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots, or invaders. And Dracula himself sleeps in earth specifically taken from his castle graveyard, ground composed of the decomposed bodies of his ancestors. Vampires coalesce out of the dust, they turn to dust once they're destroyed. And I started thinking about cremation, which I had a vague sense, being a professor of literature, not history, of starting to become popular in England in the late 19th century, right about when Stoker was writing this novel. This led me to Henry Thompson, Queen Victoria's private physician, and his role in the rise of the cremation movement in England. This passage is the opening of his 1874 treatise, The Treatment of the Body After Death. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but what I want to point out is that what I love about this is that it demonstrates so nicely the tensions in how the Victorians felt about dying and death. There's the gentle, peaceful description of the last breath, the sorrow of the mourners, the idea of tranquil sleep, eternal rest, but then there's also that keen, observing eye, the scientific interest in the physical changes taking place. By the mid-19th century in England, as with many of our own more heavily populated areas in the US, what to do with the dead was a pressing concern, both spiritually and practically. London alone had an annual death toll over 50,000 by the 1850s. annual death toll of over 50,000. And the centuries old practice of burying people in the parish churchyard had been impractical for some time. Overcrowded urban cemeteries created horribly unsanitary conditions like contaminated groundwater. And they were also rather distressing visual and olfactory presences in the urban landscape, undermining the belief in a peaceful repose in the grave. Starting in the 1830s, garden cemeteries like Highgate Cemetery and others, which became known as the Magnificent Seven in London, took much of this pressure off, providing more solitary spaces for burials and even becoming popular public destinations with wide open spaces, fresh air, beautiful architecture. But by the 1870s, it was becoming clear that space would eventually become an issue again, and with it, public health and sensibilities. In 1873, Thomson traveled to the Great Exhibition at Vienna and saw a presentation of the cremation methods of Professor Brunetti of Padua. Upon his return, he immediately started promoting the process in England. And here's where things start to get strange. Thomson starts his argument in favor of cremation by raising all of the above issues of public health and sensibilities, all very reasonable and expected. But then there is a source of very painful dread, the dread of premature burial, the fear lest some deep trance should be mistaken for death, and that the awakening should take place too late. With cremation, no such catastrophe could ever occur, and the completeness of a properly conducted process would render death instantaneous and painless if, by any unhappy chance, an individual so circumstanced were submitted to it. So, cremation will prevent the horrors of premature burial by burning you alive. This struck me as, well, rather odd reasoning. Wouldn't one want to be saved? The Victorians were obsessed with premature burial. By the 1890s, almost 200 books on premature burial had been published, and the penny dreadfuls, the cheap tabloids of the day, were full of anecdotes. Various entrepreneurs capitalized on this fear, inventing safety coffins like the ones shown here, which had various means of preserving the person buried alive should they revive, and alerting people above ground to their presence. In France, oops, missing a slide here. In France and Germany, just one second, there we go. Okay. Uh, In France and Germany, waiting mortuaries held bodies above ground and surrounded by flowers until it was certain that decomposition had set in. The anti-premature burial movements of the 1890s arose in response to more than a century of anxiety. The secular rationalism of the 18th and 19th centuries left people with a lack of spiritual solace for death and an increasing fear thereof, in the absence of a firm belief in salvation and the afterlife. But people also began to question physical death itself. Doctors and scientists were learning more all the time about what happens when we die. And the problematic result was an awareness of how much we still didn't know. What was new was the idea of dying as a process rather than life and death being two absolutely distinct states with a clear line between. Jean-Jacques Bruyère's highly influential 1746 text, The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death, focused on the difficulty of determining death. Bruyère's belief in death as a sometimes treatable, not always irreversible medical condition led the way for both fears of premature burial and the establishment of societies to save people and prevent such burials. Elsewhere, Thomson writes that the problem which he would solve by cremation is as follows. Given a dead body, to resolve it into carbonic acid, water, ammonia, etc. The problem, as the previous discussion of determining death indicates, is that a dead body is anything but given. The very nature of the relationship between ourselves and our bodies seems to have changed in a fundamental way. And here we have poll one. What to do with all the bodies? Feel free to participate or not. You're not required. This is not a quiz. Oops. think I messed something up. There should have been more options under choosing cremations. All right. I think should I just go ahead and go? I think yeah, okay. I'm going to end the poll. I've never done this before, so this is kind of fun. I guess I share results, I guess. I don't know how I do
You
that.
certainly can. You can share the
Okay.
results. Everyone can
This is
see.
all new. This is like the new thing for me. So, okay, I'm going to get rid of this now. Okay. Um, so the dualist notion of the soul, moving on, as separate from the body, encourages ideas about, uh, sorry. Okay. I think we're good now. The poll seems to be gone. Um, the dualist notion of the soul as separate from the body encourages ideas about the body being a cage, something our soul is trapped in and ultimately freed from. And this rhetoric can be very, very comforting when the dying person is suffering. But that comfort depends upon two preconditions: the certainty of physical death for the body and the certainty of some kind of rest for the soul. And I do want to take a minute here to point out, by the way, that such rhetoric can encourage a kind of ableism when it is a disabled body that is being described as a cage or prison cell. When physicist Stephen Hawking died, there were these ridiculously sentimental depictions of him floating up out of his wheelchair on angel's wings or standing up out of it and walking into a bright light. Images which disability activists rightfully pointed out were massively dismissive of his lived experience. So I just want to acknowledge that this dualist notion of the body as a cage for the soul can become problematically ableist. Once those two certainties, the certainty of physical death and the certainty of rest for the soul, once those are challenged, the body is no longer seen as just a passive cage. It becomes an active enemy of the soul. And this is when fears of premature burial really start to take off. And we can see this fear reflected in John Snart's 1817 treatise, Thesaurus of Horror, or The Charnel House Explored. And can we just take a moment to revel in the glory of the full title page here, by the way? We don't do this anymore, and I think we should. Snart posits that the spark of life can remain latent in the body, particularly in the intestines for some reason, for some time after a person seems dead, and can be revived by the torturing of the soul in the tomb. The soul cannot expire or make its escape till it has rent the enclosure quite asunder or permeated its interstices and is carried off by absorption. As spirits expand and burst the bottles which are closely corked to contain them, so the soul quickens the latent and supposed extinct spark of life to fresh action. And to be clear here, the enclosure he's talking about bursting is the body. Elsewhere, he describes a person buried alive as in a prison where the soul cannot escape from the merciless clutches of the fell monster of Gothic horror who haunts it and, like an overgrown vampire or giant sarcophagus, fastens on them, foully sucking their blood and stifles their remaining breath. What's interesting in Snart's grammar is that it is not the tomb doing this to the person. It is the body itself that is the monster, like the blood-sucking vampire, or sarcophagus, which literally means flesh eater. And oh, look, the experience of premature burial is being connected to vampirism. Perhaps I'll come back to that a little bit later. Because of the difficulties of determining death, the physical body in the grave or tomb is the source of terror and torture. Snart describes the second death infinitely worse than that designed by nature that befalls the prematurely buried victim. Terror, despair, horror, torments unknown before seize on him. Madness, rage, all, no power to live, no power to die. But the horrors of being buried alive are, for Snart, all about what the body is doing to the person. Every vein and artery bursting in the superhuman conflict, in this dreadful scuffle which knows no sensation or abatement till coagulation's influence stagnates and deprives him of all thought, and he becomes, are you ready? A fermentable mass of murdered, senseless, decomposing matter. Okay, just going to take a deep breath here Elsewhere, Snart describes what he imagines the prematurely buried person doing in the grave or tomb, the pounding and the scratching at the lid, the wailing and chewing of the shroud. But the majority of his horror is reserved for descriptions like this: the body doing these things to the person struggling against and suffering because of the body, not just in the body. And one of the weird ironies of fears of reviving in the grave is that one popular theory was that it was actually the act of burial that revived people. Reverend Walter Whiter in the early 1800s believed that the warm earth possessed remarkable powers to restore life. Indeed, he recommended that earth baths be employed as a means of revivification in cases of death trance, and argued that traditional burial in the earth actually increased the danger of awakening in the tomb. So it's not just that you might revive in the grave, but that the burial itself might be what revives you. We become our own torture chambers. So no wonder cremation starts to feel like a better alternative. And indeed, Thompson's proposal would not have seemed that strange to his contemporaries. More than half a century before Thompson started investigating cremation, Snart and his predecessors were suggesting techniques for determining death that look, to us, more like torture and destruction than salvation or security, many of which I will share with you now. So some techniques for determining death and or reviving a person: pouring liquor down the throat. I mean, that one doesn't sound too bad. Blowing smoke up the nose, or maybe inserting onion juice, horseradish, other astringents. Testing the sphincter muscle by shoving something up it, testing it with smoke. Pouring vinegar, pepper down the throat, or, urine might work. Applied galvanism, electric shock, submerging the person completely in water, taking a metal brush dipped in brine and scrubbing the bottom of the feet, shoving something sharp up the nose, cutting the ear, even cutting the soles of the feet, red hot irons placed on the soles of the feet, long needles under the toenails, red hot poker placed elsewhere. All of this sounds awful, yes, but at least the point here is to revive the person if they aren't fully dead. If they're dead, no harm, no foul, and if you manage to revive them, great, you might just have some explaining and apologizing to do. So this next bit is where it gets still weirder. And oh, you thought it couldn't get weirder. It does. Individuals started requesting, sometimes privately, sometimes legally in their wills, that things be done to their bodies to ensure that they are dead, not to potentially save them, but to kill them beyond a doubt: cutting the jugular or the carotid artery, severing the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain, opening the chest cavity to make sure the heart has ceased beating, piercing the heart or taking it out, severing the head completely, performing an autopsy, embalming. These were things that people literally wrote into their wills to have done before burial to make sure they weren't being buried alive. And it's time for poll two. What do you want done? What should we do to you before we bury you? And this one, I think you're supposed to like indicate how likely you are to want that done. Okay, here we go. A lot of you are really concerned for me. I appreciate that. Oh, think we're about 71% have finished. I'm gonna end the poll and share the results. It just blows my mind that they were literally trying these things, or doctors were recommending them in any case. Okay. I need to get rid of this. Okay. So I want to pause for a moment and preemptively answer a question that lots of people ask, often rather nervously at this point, which is how often did or does premature burial actually take place? I have two answers for you. The first is we don't really know, but the second is not as often as people like Snart feared. The vast majority of stories of people actually reviving in the grave and being rescued are apocryphal, found in folk tales, which are then revamped for the popular penny dreadfuls of the era. There are a few well-documented cases of people reviving as a result of a coffin being jostled on the way to the graveyard, and some instances of people reviving on the dissecting table. One such man died as a result of the process, but one young woman went on to live a long, full life. The problem is, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do we know who might have been revived in the grave and not gotten out? And that's a fair question. Because of the overcrowding of urban cemeteries, bodies were frequently being disinterred and then stored in ossuaries or burned to make room for more bodies. This was the case even in the country churchyards of pre-industrial England, when a family plot would periodically be emptied to make room for another generation. Our modern idea of a cemetery plot that is yours for all eternity is really quite recent. The problem was, in the process of disinterring these bodies, people would come across what looked like, key phrase, looked like the cases of premature burial. And I'm going to get gruesome here for just a minute. Signs of the head and knees having been raised up against the coffin lid, the appearance of the hands and nails scratching at the lid and sides, mummified faces seemingly locked in an expression of horror. If you opened an old coffin and saw all of that, of course you would think that person had fought and lost a mighty battle. But as 20th century scientists began to study the process of decay, they learned that that process is anything but inactive. Due to the differences between bone, flesh, and other body tissues, when we decompose, there can be a lot of shifting and movement. Limbs contract and move, the jaw falls. In other words, many of those signs of struggle could be accounted for by the natural and incredibly complicated processes of decomposition. Bottom line, were some people buried alive? Yes. And even now, occasionally, I'll see a story about somebody pronounced dead waking up in a morgue. It does happen, but it happens way less often than people think. So if I've worried you a bit, just take a moment, take a deep breath or two, and relax. Okay, good. So, as a result of these fears, being prematurely buried had become worse than being actually dead, even though in theory one could be revived and saved. How does the body become the enemy? Not in the traditional dualist sense of a cage for the soul, but as something that actively participates in the torture of the person. I'm going to talk about liminality here. Liminality is a sort of between space or state in which we are suspended between two known things, not belonging to either one, but defined by them. Thus, a shoreline is a liminal space between the ocean and the land, defined by both those things, but not really belonging to either one. In terms of the human experience, we often define liminal times and mark them with rituals. Many cultures have had rituals for adolescence, marking the end of their childhood, their entry into adulthood. The important part here is that if the liminal space or state itself is uncertain and potentially even vulnerable and dangerous, it is carefully contained by the two known states on either side of it. Dying is a liminal state between life, known, and death, previously known as a matter of faith or science. But what happens to the liminal state when one of the book-ending conditions that define it is no longer known? It is useful here, I think, to distinguish not just between life and death, but between biological death and symbolic death. Symbolic death is essentially a wrapping up of our symbolic existence, and it includes such things as legal documents like wills, personal acts like last goodbyes, religious rituals such as a final confession, last rites. Ideally, in our classic idea of the good death, our biological and symbolic deaths happen simultaneously. When they do not, the liminal space created between them challenges our ways of understanding and opens up the possibilities of both vulnerability and danger. What are ghosts if not the result of someone dying biologically without symbolic closure? The classic ghost is a spirit still tied to this realm by unfinished business, only able to move on once someone still living has helped them achieve their symbolic death. But for this to work, biological death has to be a given. What happens when it's not? When the work of symbolic death has been performed, but we are still biologically alive. And here's why premature burial is worse than death beyond just the horror of the experience, because there's something transformative about it. When we come back from the dead, we come back changed because we have been released from those symbolic ties. The fear of premature burial has at its heart a perverse fear of the resurrection of the body into something else, something liminal between life and death, some uncanny other version of ourselves. Common legends about premature burial often followed a pattern like this. Dead noblewoman's body is dug up by grave robbers, who are then terrified by her suddenly returning to life. Rather than focusing on any of the joy her family might feel, the stories focus, as this is from an 1832 example, on the horror of her state. But life gleams from these opening eyes, blood thrills that lifted hand, and awful words are in her cries which none may understand. The suggestion that her words are not understandable would seem to imply that she is something other than what she was before she was pronounced dead and buried. And that brings me back to Dracula. I'm going to focus on one character primarily here, so I'll just give a brief summary of the important plot points around her. When the novel opens, Dracula is getting bored in his castle in Transylvania and wants a change of scenery. Specifically, he wants to go to England. He arrives in Whitby on the eastern coast and immediately starts vamping Lucy Westenra, beautiful, wealthy young woman who's surrounded by suitors and has only recently accepted the hand of young aristocrat Arthur Holmwood. As Dracula continues to feed on her, she becomes weaker and weaker. One of her former suitors, Dr. Seward, calls in Dr. Abraham Van Helsing from Amsterdam, his old professor and mentor. Van Helsing recognizes what is going on, but also realizes he can't just say she's being bitten by a vampire because no one will believe him. So instead, he performs a series of blood transfusions. This was a new technology at the time, and without knowledge of blood types, they just didn't know why a bunch of people died. With all just these blood transfusions with all the men who love her, giving their blood for her. They are unsuccessful, however, and she dies and is interred in the family tomb. So, where Snart compared being buried alive to some sort of vampiric experience, Stoker does the reverse. When Van Helsing tells Arthur that they need to disinter his fiancée Lucy because there's some problem with her body, Arthur exclaims, "What do you mean? Has there been any mistake? Has she been buried alive?" He groaned in anguish that not even hope could soften. His horror over the thought of her being buried alive cannot even be lessened by the thought that she might therefore be saved. And he's kind of right, just not in the way he fears. She has become something else. The vampire Lucy is an evil twin, a doppelganger. Van Helsing reassures Arthur that it is not simply a demon in Lucy's shape. It is her body, he says, and yet not it. She seemed, Seward writes, like a nightmare of Lucy. The vampiric state, then, is an extreme manifestation of that same horror attendant upon the prospect of premature burial, a horror felt both by those who fear being thus buried and those who fear encountering a reviving corpse. I draw quite a bit on Montague Summers' 1928 book, The Vampire, His Kith and Kin. And this is a fascinating read, both for its content, it's incredibly detailed, but also because you start to feel like Summers is lacking in scholarly detachment and might actually believe this stuff. He's pretty fascinating. Anyway, he points out that many cultures, as he said, desired to keep the dead, to preserve the mortal shell. There can be nothing more horrible, no crime more repellent than the profanation of the dead. And vampirism, he argues, represents an extreme form of such profanation. Elizabeth Bronfen argues that Dracula should thus be read as a novel about Western culture's anxiety and fascination with the ambivalent status into which the body enters once it has died. In other words, the vampire, she says, undoes the safe and secure boundaries between the living and the dead, just as premature burial does. But to go back to my discussion of symbolic death and ghosts earlier, here the situation is reversed. Both the vampire and the prematurely buried person have symbolically died. Their affairs have been wrapped up, rituals have been performed, their estates settled. But the delay of their ultimate biological death opens up this liminal state of monstrosity. As Summers says, they are a living, mischievous, and murderous dead body. A living body, the living dead body. The words are idle, contradictory, incomprehensible. but so are vampires. Van Helsing's description of the vampires as undead, and that's a word Stoker considered using as the title for his novel, is perfect in this sense. Undead is not the opposite of dead. That would be alive. The vampires and prematurely buried people are something else entirely. When Lucy dies, her first death after her long illness of being repeatedly bitten by Dracula, getting all these blood transfusions, her vampiric state gives her back the appearance of perfect health and beauty. And she is so lively that Seward, he says, could not believe that I was looking at a corpse. Furthermore, every hour into her vampiric state seemed to be enhancing her loveliness. It frightened and amazed me somewhat, and her fiancé Arthur even asks, Jack, is she really dead? Instead of bringing decay and dissolution, the changes being wrought in this supposedly given dead body are returning her to something like life, but not life, something undead. This indeterminacy of death is the first sign that something isn't right. The second is that Vampire Lucy starts feeding on small children. Was that a big jump? Stoker does not pull punches in this novel. Vampire Lucy is, as I quoted above, a nightmare of Lucy, and thus a nightmare of all the ways in which Victorian women were idealized as wives and mothers. So it makes sense that instead of nurturing children herself, she now feeds upon them. Similarly, destroying her requires a nightmare version of marital intimacy, with Arthur, the man she should have married, staking her in a scene that regularly shocks my undergraduate students who all think Victorian literature is prudish and tame. And once she is true dead, as Van Helsing calls it, she reassuringly decays. She is seen with traces of care and pain and waste, but these were all dear to us, for they marked her truth to what we knew. She is no longer a figure of horror, but tender regard and grief. She is now both symbolically dead and truly biologically dead. Stoker's done something incredibly clever in his depiction of vampirism. When a vampire is destroyed, their human body catches up. In other words, their body is instantly in the state it would have been in had it naturally decayed all that while. Lucy's only been a vampire for a few days, so the men recognize the natural signs of pain of her illness and waste of her early decay. But the older vampires, Dracula himself and the three lady vamps in his castle, have been vampires much longer, and when they are destroyed, they instantly dissolve into dust, though not, of course, before reassuringly giving their destroyers a glance of grateful peace. And we're one last poll, fan club questions. This is if you, especially if you know Dracula, but some fun questions. Last poll. These are anonymous, by the way. If you like Twilight, I'm not going to know, and I won't judge you anyway. Okay, excellent. Interesting. More people want to be a vampire. I don't know if you, oh yeah, you guys probably can't, so I'm going to share the results here. You can see lots more people want to be a vampire. A few more people, fans of Mina. Excellent. All right. Um, okay, let me get rid of this. So, in this sense, cremation, back to cremation, the reduction of the body to ash can be viewed as the ultimate bringing together of symbolic and biological deaths. The symbolic death of the individual is made coincidental with the total destruction of the body, so that there's no danger of any unalive or undead state threatening the community. The symbolic nature of this death can be seen in Henry Thompson's argument that cremation was civilized and progressive, bringing together utility, efficiency, and economy in a way that was completely lacking in overcrowded urban cemeteries. In other words, our symbolic death doesn't just tie up our relationships with our friends and families, but it also wraps up our relationships with and obligations to the society around us. The dead body has a pact with society. The dead body has a responsibility not to hurt anyone. And society has a responsibility not to bury anyone who isn't dead. Like vampirism, traditional burial, with its threat of prematurity, leads to an undead afterlife, in which, as Thompson says, the pestilential germs which have destroyed the body in question are thus so treasured and protected as to propagate and multiply, ready to reappear and work like ruin hereafter for others. By contrast, cremationists emphasized the connotations of strength and purity in dust. Nothing can be more pure, Thompson argues, tested by sight or smell than the remains after cremation are, and nothing less suggestive of decay or decomposition. It is a refined sublimate and not a portion of refuse, which I have before me. Instead of rotting into a corrupt and dangerous mass, we are made sublime, purified by fire. Cremation gives truth and reality to the grand and solemn words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that impressive service will be read with a fullness of meaning never conveyed before. The last rite has purified the body. Its elements of physical evil have been annihilated by fire. Already its dispersed constituents, having escaped the long imprisonment of the tomb, pursue their eternal circuit in harmony with nature's uniform and perfect course. As we become dust, the cremationists argue, we return to nature's base of generative material and become part of the great cycle of life. The vampires, on the other hand, might be said to selfishly hang on to their raw materials. They refuse to become part of that natural regenerative cycle and instead continue to feed off of it in their unnatural state of suspended corruption. Thompson's final argument on what we can do with cremated remains emphasizes this sense of a return to a pure state. Cremation has created an opportunity for restoring the purified remains of the Christian worshiper to the consecrated precincts of his church, whence the corruptible body has now for many years been banished by urgent sanitary necessity, achieving for the dead person a broader symbolic death in relation to the community. Concluding now. So, death is both a personal and a social phenomenon. We experience it both biologically and symbolically, and in both cases, it is potentially more problematic than we would like to think. The Victorians took the symbolic rituals of death to new levels of public display and personal grieving, in part as a response to greater uncertainty about death, both biologically and spiritually. But the effect of all this display and ritual was to obscure as much as possible the presence of the object at the center of it all, the dead body. These anxieties over death, repressed under mountains of crepe and black edged stationery, reappear particularly strongly in two late century phenomenon, the rise in cremation and Bram Stoker's Dracula, both of which center around the problems of our dead or undead bodies. Both premature burial and vampirism raise problems with the issue of the symbolic death and the crucial pact between society and the dead. In the case of premature burial, the community has failed in its duty not to bury someone who isn't dead. And in the case of vampirism, the dead body has failed in its duty to actually be dead. Until both symbolic and biological death are both achieved, we are in the liminal realm of uncertainty of either tortured victim or dangerous monster, and which we must face depends upon which part of the contract has been left unfulfilled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tandy Schreiber. I think many of us will give Dracula another read and consider everything that you've shared today. We're now going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. So just a quick reminder, you can submit questions or comments through the Q&A button. We have a number of questions that have come in, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can before the end of our event. Our questions do seem to be focusing either on literature or on the history of death rituals, so I'm going to try to group them together. But to kick things off, I did want to ask, how did you become interested in death studies in the first place? What led you to this?
Um, well, unlike a lot of my friends who also study this, I was not a goth kid. I never mastered the black eyeliner or dyed my hair black but I think I'm very interested in urban settings in cities. And it doesn't take long walking around especially an old city like London or Paris, European cities. It does not take long to realize that cities are full of dead people. Um, humans, we have to deal with our dead. There's no ignoring our dead. At a very, very early stage in hominid development, anthropologists talk about a shift where early on you just see bodies being disposed of away from human settlements. But at a certain point, we started burying them in ritual ways, taking care of our dead. Certain positions facing a certain way, being buried with grave goods. And this is sort of generally taken as a sign of this is a moment when we start to believe that there's something about us that's not just our bodies, and that our bodies continue to be important symbolically. So there's no human culture has ever existed that didn't do something with its dead. We have to deal with it. And this becomes particularly interesting, as I say, in these dense urban environments that have been continuously occupied for thousands of years. The dead population of a city like London far outweighs its living population. And I'm interested in how cities continue to be modern cities and to develop and grow while still sort of navigating that past and being respectful of that past as well.
Thank you. Well, we'll stick with this line of questioning. One of our attendees has asked, "What is a favorite death or funeral ritual that you've learned about over the course of your research?"
Oh my goodness. I I mean, I think they're all so fascinating. The one that I've been thinking about recently is I heard about a woman at her memorial service. She planned her own memorial service, and she instructed her children to make little cards that had like a Ouija board on the front, and on back it said "Stay in touch." um, I think we're in a really interesting time now where we've relaxed a lot of the sort of expected rituals around death, and people are much freer to do what they want, and to sort of create their own rituals. I think but I think most people still feel it's important to do something ritual. Um, so I think I always sort of have a sense of humor about it because, and I tell my students this, humor is one of the key ways we handle something that is stressful or makes us anxious. And so I think the more that we can sort of find humor and pleasantries in those things, the better. Um, okay, and I'll say another one that I think is fascinating, which is like Victorian hair jewelry, morning jewelry, is really beautiful and is an art that's being revived by some practitioners who are taking hair and creating beautiful things out of it. That's a really good one.
That is great to know. I've definitely seen a number of those of hair art, certainly in museums. So that's interesting that it's making a comeback. We do have a question about mourning traditions, so kind of in line with that. Why have mourning traditions changed over time? It feels less public now and very more private than in Victorian times. When did we stop wearing black armbands or dressing entirely in black?
The armbands, the dressing in black, that's very much a Victorian thing, both England and America. And we can thank Queen Victoria for that. Prince Albert died in 1860s. I'm being a bad Victorianist, not knowing exactly when he died. And she went into mourning. She became the Widow of Windsor. She dressed in all black, and she never came out of that. And that kind of set a fashion standard of dressing in all black. And of course, this becomes something that people can make a lot of money off it. So they promote this as, oh, it's traditional. It's important to do this to properly mourn your loved one. Buy all of your clothes from us. We know how to do this. So the fashion for wearing all black is sort of definitely sort of second half of the 19th century. It primarily falls to women to enact these rituals, in part because the men had to go back to work. The men can't go into extended mourning. But there were books written about like your deep mourning lasts for 6 months, and then after that you can start to have a black and gray dress instead of all black. And the rules about how your clothing can change sort of gets extended over time. Again, notice that each one of these stages is another way to sell you more stuff and get you to buy stuff. And I think there's two reactions to that. By the 20th century, that, along with a lot of other things about the Victorian era, starts to look very repressive and restrictive. And people start to kind of rebel against what they perceive as this real repression in the Victorian time. And so, I mean, it's not people still will wear black for a funeral, but most people don't sort of go into extended mourning, and people also will wear other colors at funerals. But I always feel like if there would certainly have been people who felt like those mourning traditions, having to wear all black, not being able to go out into society, there would certainly have been people who would feel that that was repressive, particularly perhaps young widows who might want to restart their lives. But I also have to think that there would have been people who found great comfort in that, because if you were dressed that way, that was a sign to the rest of your society that said, I am a person in mourning. You need to treat me certain ways. So I think it could also be a real kind of almost armor for some people to help them get through this very difficult time. Um, so it in part, I think like I said, I think we've reacted in the 20th century to so much of the Victorian era as, oh, they were all prudish and repressed and everything. And it's a very simplistic idea of the Victorians, really. And so in part, we sort of turned away from that. Um, I'll sort of answer, I know I'm kind of going on and on here, but the other thing that really happens at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century is that we medicalized death. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people died at home. They died surrounded by their loved ones, maybe a priest, maybe a doctor. The families washed the bodies. The families kept the bodies for a couple days and then eventually, took it to be buried. People were very familiar with death. And of course, they experienced more of it. Up until well into the 19th century, the mortality rate was 50% for children. 50% of people died before they reached the age of 10. So there was a lot of it, and it happened in the home, and families took care of those bodies. When we started making advances in medicine that I'm all for, by the way, these are great. I'm very happy to live in this world. But when we started bringing people to the hospital to try to, maybe we don't have to die, maybe we can help us save a person, people started dying in hospitals instead or other kinds of medical settings. And then this idea sort of came up of like, well, now it's better for the family if we just whisk the body away and they don't have to see the body. You don't want to see grandma and grandpa anymore. Once they're dead, they're gone. Let's take the body away. And so we kind of lost that familiarity with it, and even comfort with it. That is now changing again. There are a lot of people that we have a lot of more options of how and where we can die and how our loved ones can be involved in that process. But that the medicalization of death that happened in the first half of the 20th century is something we're still really figuring out how to back off from, because when you ask somebody where would you like to die, almost nobody says in a hospital. We want to die somewhere in our home or somewhere where we're comfortable. We don't want to die in that kind of situation, but so many of us do.
All right, we have a couple questions related to grave sites and graves. So I'm going to ask two of them. One is, how do you see these things, your presentation, factored into the trope or phenomenon of disturbed grave sites, cemeteries with supernatural consequences? And then also, are graves traditionally 6 feet deep so that the deceased doesn't come back, or is that an urban legend?
6 feet deep one. I have friends who work in cemeteries who could answer that better than I can. I mean, I think first of all, again, that notion of a grave that's your spot for all eternity and your spot alone, that's American because we have space and it's really new. For most of human history, burials in churchyards, you'd maybe start 6 feet deep, but then a year later you sort of are going to go back in and bury the next person and just kind of plunk them down on top. And those previous bodies, as they decomposed, would be removed and perhaps stored in an ossuary or even burned, or maybe sometimes just kind of dug and rearranged and smushed down a little. So, kind of get grandma further down in there so you can put somebody else there. Um, so I don't know that there's a magic number to the 6 feet issue, because again, that's what we think of as standard and the rule, but it really isn't. And hasn't been. The other one, the trope of the disturbed grave sites leading to sort of these supernatural consequences. I mean, that's such a great horror movie kind of trope, and I think it precisely comes back to the idea of symbolic death, that a person is not truly fully dead until you have done all of those things, whether, again, it's the legal stuff, the wills, the estates, the saying goodbye to loved ones, or the religious rituals of a priest, a functionary coming in and doing these things. And the burial is part of that symbolic death too. That is sort of the last symbolic thing we do for the dead person is we give them to the earth. We give them back to whatever they wanted done with their body. So if you're disturbing that as a living person, you are really violating that really important symbolic contract that the living and the dead have with each other. And I think that that's at the heart of why, if in a story, that's always going to lead to bad things for you. Yeah. Don't do that. Don't disturb people's graves. Don't.
Excellent advice. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move into some of our questions that focus more on literature and Dracula. So one question came in. Our audience member is curious. They have always read Dracula as being in large part about the Victorian terror of female sexuality. Lucy's monstrousness in her undeath seems to derive in large part from her unfeminine boldness. Do you think that this is because she has transcended social norms by entering this liminal state?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, Dracula it's about all of these things together. It is very much about that fear of uncontained female sexuality. And Lucy is this is like my favorite quote about Lucy when like the first thing we hear from her, she's writing to Mina, her best friend, and talking about how these three men all proposed to her on one day. And she says, why can't they let a girl marry three men at once or as many as want her? And she's sort of, oh, but I shouldn't say these things. And of course, she's chosen, this young aristocrat. But she's absolutely, even before she is dead, or being vamped, she is presented to us as overly sexually determined. She absolutely is. Um, and so when we read it, it's a fragmented book. You get it in bits and pieces and kind of have to put the puzzle together as the people in the book do. And it's easy to miss the fact that Dracula doesn't come to Whitby because he's like I'm trying to sort of figure out how to say this. He's sort of as much drawn to Lucy as Lucy is drawn to him. Like there's something that pulls him there and pulls her out at night to meet him. So that there is something determinant about her and her sexuality. And so, yes, absolutely, the process of vampirism for women is this much highly sexualized kind of imagery, which is why she's then inverted and becomes the maternal figure feeding upon the child instead of feeding the child. Um, that's true of the lady vamps in Dracula's castle. They're very sexually alluring. Jonathan Harker's horrified by them. And in the second half of the novel, when Lucy's been finally taken care of and Mina Harker, Jonathan's wife, starts to be vamped, it plays out very, very differently because she is not a hypersexualized character, and you only just start to get hints of that before she is return to human safety. But yes, it absolutely is. And that liminal state allows that dangerous sexuality to come out. Yeah.
And kind of sticking with this line of questioning, we have a attendee who asked, aside from Carmilla, what other books or stories feature or center a female vampire? And perhaps you can also share with the audience
Right.
more about Carmilla.
Yeah. I mean, and I will be the first to admit I don't know all the vampire lore out there. Um, I'm trying to think because there's Coleridge also had a vampire poem about a female vampire. And when they do those what's interesting though, I think about those other female vampires is that they are much more explicitly sort of lesbian vampire figures. Whereas the female vampires in Stoker are much more sort of kind of kept heteronormative for the most part. That's the strongest impulse there. But other female vampires tend to seek out female victims, and sort of again in these very kinds of sexualized ways. Uh, of course, I'm drawing a blank, and as the minute this is over, I will think of 10 easy examples right off the top of my head. But at the moment, it's kind of, it is sort of escaping me, I will admit.
That's all right. Thank you for attempting to answer that and pointing us in some directions that we could certainly look into. We do have a question, so I'll see if you're able to answer this one if you're familiar with this character. One of our guests asks, all of this, of course, focuses on English British culture at the time, but something I always found particularly interesting about Dracula was the inclusion of the American in the form of Quincy Morris. Do you have any knowledge or suggested resources on how all of these ideas and practices translated eventually into the American psyche and eventually the American vampire?
Quincy Morris, I love him. He's like the token American. He's one of the three suitors who wants to marry Lucy. And he's like this, he's like got oil fields in Texas. He's Texan and he says things like, Miss Lucy, I'm not fit to hitch your wagon to my, to my horse. I mean, it's so ridiculously stereotypical. He's utterly delightful. But I think he functions in a couple of ways in the novel. One is that he seems to be able to see things and ask questions that the English characters don't. They're talking about how Lucy's lost all this blood. She's lost all this blood, and he's the one who goes, "Wait, she's had how many blood transfusions now?" And they're like, "Yeah, all of us." And he's like, "Well, what took it out?" Like he's the one who asks what took it out. Um, he, he also, of course, brings all the guns, being an American, and at one point goes out. They're all talking and having a meeting, and he sees a bat outside the window and goes, "Oh, maybe I'll go shoot that bat." And none of them are like, "Duh, that's Dracula." Anyway, but he's also sacrificed. Like he's of this little band of men that sort of rallies around Mina to protect her and to destroy Dracula. Quincy's the one who's sacrificed, so I always feel like he's the sacrificial American, right? Kind of convenient, and all the British people are then preserved. In terms of American vampire stories, I mean, I don't know that our tradition is that different from ours. I mean, this novel, comes out in the 1890s and is immensely popular and was, published here. There were instantly stage versions of it. Copyright laws were, there were stage versions of it. There were, the early films, Bela Lugosi, 1931. So Dracula itself became very, very popular over here very, very quickly. I think the biggest next shift in vampire lore is then Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire in the 70s, where she tells the story from the point of view of the vampires. And she created a very different perspective that's part of a bigger trend in the second half of the 20th century of us retelling these tales and kind of being interested in the monster. It's in the second half of the 20th century when we start getting, making the Frankenstein's creature, making him more sympathetic in roles and giving him more of a voice. Same thing with werewolves, with vampires. Now they're the heroes of Twilight and whatnot, that kind of thing. So I think the probably the next really big thing that happens in America in terms of vampirism is Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, which, by the way, the new series that they're making of that is fantastic. It's very, very fun. Anyway, hope that helps.
I think so. Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask this one that came through, which kind of ties it all, brings us back to the beginning of your presentation. A couple of the ways of verifying death are traditional ways of killing a vampire. Which came first? Is that a coincidence?
You know, the vampire lore of okay, some of the traditional ways of killing a vampire, cutting the head off. That's the one that comes to mind that was on that list. But the vampire lore was very, very the sort of a big loose collection of folk tales. A lot of the things that we take for granted as standard in vampire lore were actually created by Stoker. Stoker did a ton of research. There's a library here in Rochester, New York, I think, that has all of his working papers. He did so much research for this, and picked and chose and all the different folklore. We have all of his notes. He's the one who does the whole garlic thing. He's the one who does the crucifix thing, and the wafer, the communion wafer. The turning into bats, turning into other things. That all is Stoker sort of, he again doesn't necessarily invent them, but he pulls them together, and what we think of as, oh yes, these are the qualities of a vampire are actually created by him. So that cutting the head off, That's a good question, which came first, because that may have been what let me try to start that sentence again. I know that when I have heard about supposed, occasionally you'll hear like, oh, we were excavating a graveyard in, Eastern Europe and we found what must have been a vampire burial. You hear about things like a brick placed between the jaw so that they can't close their mouth. You hear about bodies being buried upside down so that when they go to dig out, they will go down instead of up. You do hear, I think, about sort of heads being cut off. But vampires were also not the only way that bodies could come back. Like there's lots of different kinds of folk tales of people not staying dead. And in particular, the people who don't stay dead are the people with bad deaths, people who were murdered, people who were killed, people who took their own lives, people who weren't buried in consecrated ground. Again, that symbolic contract has not been fulfilled. Um, so I have a feeling that part of the answer to the question is that these ways of killing vampires would have also been used in other kinds of situations. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our event. We've made it through many of our questions. Apologies to those that we did not get to, but thank you for submitting questions and comments. A special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Tandy Triver, for sharing her research. This is our final event in the Dark Reflections series this year. So you will find recordings of this event and other presentations on our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. So thank you all again, and I do hope you will join us at a future CLA event.
Thanks for all the great questions, everybody. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.